They thought he was just another passenger. They judged him by his appearance, unleashing a torrent of humiliation and brute force. Dragged from his seat, paraded like a criminal, he endured it all. But they had no idea who they were messing with. In a single moment, everything changed. The aggressors became the terrified. The victim. He was an FBI special agent. This is the shocking story of how a routine flight with Global Air Connect turned into a nightmare at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, and how the tables were turned with the flash of a badge, leading to consequences no one involved would ever forget. Special Agent David Robinson settled into his window seat, 14A, on Global Air Connect Flight 723, non-stop from Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport to Washington Dulles. He let out a slow exhale, the kind that signaled the end of one draining chapter and the reluctant beginning of another. For the past 72 hours, he'd been deep undercover part of a multi-agency task force, busting a human trafficking ring operating out of a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of Atlanta. The operation had been a success, but the images, the faces of the victims, still clung to him like the humid Georgia air he was leaving behind. David was a man of medium height, lean and athletic, with eyes that had seen too much, but still held a spark of resolute determination. He was dressed in comfortable civilian clothes, a dark grey Henley well-worn jeans and sturdy boots. His backpack, stowed neatly under the seat in front of him, contained his laptop, a change of clothes, and case files for his next assignment. His service weapon and badge were of course secured according to all regulations for a law enforcement officer, flying armed, a fact meticulously documented with the airline and the TSA beforehand. He wasn't looking for trouble. All he wanted was 2 hours of relative peace, maybe catch a nap before landing and heading straight to FBI headquarters for a debrief. He pulled out a worn paperback, a collection of John D. MacDonald mysteries, hoping to lose himself in Travis McGee's world for a while. The boarding process for Flight 723 was its usual chaotic symphony of rolling suitcases, anxious parents, and seat assignment squabbles. David observed it all with a practiced, almost detached eye. He noticed the flight attendant at the front, a woman named Karen with a tight perm and an even tighter smile, who seemed to be making a mental note of every passenger who didn't immediately conform to her idea of ideal. He saw the gate agent, a harried-looking man named Henderson, rush on board to confer with her, his face etched with stress. Standard pre-flight jitters, David assumed. A young couple, visibly excited about their trip, fumbled with their oversized carry-ons in the aisle. David offered a small, reassuring smile, which went unnoticed. He wasn't invisible, but he was good at blending in, a skill honed by years in the bureau. Sometimes, however, his very presence, a black man sitting quietly observing, seemed to set off invisible alarms in certain people. He'd learned to live with it, to navigate the subtle and not-so-subtle currents of prejudice with a weary patience, though it never ceased to grate. As the last few passengers trickled in, David noticed a slight commotion near the front galley. 2 airline ground staff, their Global Air Connect uniforms crisp, were speaking in hushed, urgent tones with Karen, the flight attendant. She kept glancing down the aisle, her gaze sweeping over the passengers. David felt a faint prickle of unease, the kind of sixth sense that had kept him alive in far more dangerous situations. He casually glanced around. Everyone seemed normal, settling in. What could be the issue? The overhead bins were slammed shut. The cabin door was about to close. The captain's voice came over the intercom. A calm, reassuring baritone, welcoming everyone aboard and giving the flight details. David started to relax. Maybe it was nothing. Then he saw them. 2 uniformed security personnel, not TSA, but contracted airport security. Their badges read ASI Secure Solutions, were making their way slowly down the aisle, their eyes scanning faces. Karen, the flight attendant, trailed them, pointing discreetly. David's internal radar went from amber to red. This wasn't random. They were looking for someone specific. His gaze met Karen's for a fleeting second. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Accusation. Disdain. He couldn't be sure. But then her finger almost imperceptibly seemed to hesitate in his direction as she murmured something to the lead security guard. A burly man with a crew cut and a name tag that read, Miller. Miller's eyes locked onto David. He was a few rows away, but David could feel the weight of that stare. It was cold, appraising, and filled with an assumption that David knew all too well. He kept his expression neutral, his body language relaxed, though every nerve ending was now on high alert. He'd done nothing wrong, had followed every procedure to the letter. He was a federal agent. This had to be a mistake. Miller approached his partner, a younger, jumpier man named Diaz, flanking him. "Sir." Miller began, his voice unnecessarily loud, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. "We need you to come with us." David looked up his bookmark, still in his paperback. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked calmly, his voice even. He made a point of using the term officer, a small test of their professionalism. "We just need to ask you a few questions off the aircraft," Miller said, his hand resting near the taser on his belt. "Please collect your belongings and come with us. Now." The now was an order sharp and impatient. Passengers were openly staring now, conversations dying down. The cabin moments before, filled with the buzz of departure, was becoming uncomfortably silent. David could feel the familiar heat rising in his chest, a mixture of anger and profound weariness. He'd been through this before in different forms at different times, but never on a plane, never with this level of public spectacle. "I'm sorry, but what is this regarding?" David asked, keeping his tone polite but firm. He knew his rights. They couldn't just remove him without cause. Karen, the flight attendant, stepped forward, her voice laced with a false sweetness that barely masked her agitation. "Sir, we just need to verify a few things. It'll be much quicker if you cooperate." Her eyes darted to the other passengers, a silent plea for them to see her as the one in control, the one handling a situation. "Verify what things?" David pressed. He wasn't going to be railroaded. He thought about his badge nestled securely in his bag. Revealing it now might de-escalate things, but it also felt like playing his trump card too early. He wanted to understand the basis of this before it went any further. This felt wrong, deeply unprofessional. Miller's face hardened. "Look, are you going to come quietly, or do we have to do this the hard way?" The hard way. The phrase hung in the air, heavy and threatening. David saw Diaz shift his weight, his hand also moving towards his own equipment. The passengers around him were a mixture of fear, curiosity, and in some faces a disturbing flicker of agreement with the security officers. As if his mere presence, his questioning of authority, was proof of guilt. David made a decision. He would comply for now. But he would also remember every detail, every word, every inflection. He slowly reached for his backpack. "All right," he said, his voice still steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside. "Let's go." He knew with a sinking certainty that this was only the beginning. The walk from seat 14A to the front of the aircraft felt like a mile-long gauntlet of shame. Every eye was on David Robinson. He could hear the whispers, the rustle of clothing as people craned their necks. He saw the fear in some faces, the judgment in others. A child started to cry, and his mother quickly shushed him, pulling him closer as if David were a contagion. The humiliation was a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders. Miller walked slightly ahead of him, Diaz a step behind, creating an unmistakable image, a suspect under escort. Karen, the flight attendant, stood near the galley, her arms crossed, a look of smug vindication on her face. As David passed, she muttered just loud enough for him to hear. "Should have cooperated from the start." David didn't respond. He focused on keeping his breathing even, his movements deliberate. He was an FBI agent. He'd faced down armed criminals, stared into the eyes of killers. This was different. This wasn't about physical danger. It was an assault on his dignity, his identity. It was the slow, grinding injustice of being singled out, prejudged. Once on the jet bridge, away from the prying eyes of most passengers, the tone shifted immediately. Miller's already aggressive demeanor hardened further. "All right, up against the wall," he barked, gesturing to the corrugated side of the jet bridge. "Excuse me," David said, stopping. "I've agreed to come with you to answer questions. What's this about? Standard procedure for uncooperative individuals," Miller snapped. "We need to ensure officer safety. Hands on the wall." Diaz, emboldened by his partner, chimed in. "Yeah, pal, we don't know what you're carrying." David's training screamed at him. This was an unlawful stop, an escalating harassment. "I am not uncooperative," David stated, his voice now carrying a steely edge. "I asked a legitimate question regarding why I was being removed from the flight. I am a law-abiding citizen, and I have complied with your request to leave the aircraft." "We'll be the judge of that," Miller retorted. He took a step closer, invading David's personal space. "We received a report of a suspicious individual matching your description, causing a disturbance and refusing to follow crew instructions." David's mind reeled. "A disturbance refusing instructions? I was sitting in my seat reading a book. I haven't spoken to a crew member since I boarded, other than to ask you what this was about." This was a fabrication, a blatant lie. Someone had made a false report. He glanced back towards the aircraft door, where Karen was now standing watching. Her. It had to be her. "Are you calling the flight attendant a liar?" Miller challenged, his voice rising. "I'm stating the facts of my actions," David replied, his gaze unwavering. "I have done nothing to warrant this treatment." This was the moment, the point where he could, and perhaps should, identify himself. But a stubborn part of him, the part that had endured countless microaggressions and outright racist encounters, wanted to see how far they would take this. He also knew that revealing his badge now in this agitated state could be misconstrued or even ignored by these two low-rent cowboys. He needed witnesses, or at least a more official setting. "Empty your pockets, and that bag," Miller demanded, pointing to David's backpack. David hesitated. His badge and credentials were in the bag. His service weapon, properly declared and stowed for flight according to federal law, was also in there in its locked case. This was about to get very complicated, if mishandled by these two. "I have personal and professional items in that bag," David said carefully, "some of which are sensitive. I am happy to discuss this with a supervisor or with airport police in a more private setting." Miller scoffed. "Oh, sensitive items, huh? Like what you got something to hide." He exchanged a look with Diaz, who snickered. The condescension was infuriating. David took a deep breath. "I am a federal law enforcement officer," he stated clearly and distinctly. For a split second, Miller and Diaz paused. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Miller's face, but it was quickly replaced by renewed aggression, perhaps even a doubling down to avoid losing face. "Oh yeah, a federal officer," Miller sneered, drawing out the words mockingly. "And I'm the chief of police. Everyone's a somebody when they're in trouble. Let's see some ID then, officer." He made air quotes with his fingers. This was going from bad to worse. Their unprofessionalism was astounding. "My identification and credentials are in my bag," David said. "As I mentioned, I am armed in accordance with federal regulations for LEOs flying. I request that you call your supervisor and perhaps a representative from the Atlanta Police Department Airport Division immediately, so this can be handled correctly." The mention of a weapon, even a legally declared one, seemed to flip a switch in Miller. Instead of caution, it ignited a kind of frenzied panic in him. "He says he's got a gun!" Miller yelled, suddenly much louder, as if playing to an unseen audience. Diaz, who looked genuinely scared, now fumbled for his handcuffs. "I said I am a law enforcement officer, authorized to carry, and it is secured and declared." David bit out his patience, wearing dangerously thin. He knew this was escalating beyond a simple misunderstanding into a potentially dangerous confrontation driven by incompetence and prejudice. "On the ground, now!" Miller shouted, drawing his taser and aiming it at David's chest. Diaz, clumsy in his fear, finally managed to unclip his handcuffs. "This is completely unnecessary," David protested, holding his hands up slowly, palms open. "I'm trying to comply and ensure this is handled professionally." But Miller wasn't listening. His eyes were wide, his face flushed. He was caught in a loop of his own making, fueled by his biases and now a fear of being wrong. He couldn't back down. "You were identified as a threat. You admitted to having a weapon, down on the ground, or I'll tase you, I swear to God." David looked from the taser pointed at his chest to Miller's distorted face, then to Diaz, who was trembling but determined. He thought of the 72 hours he'd just spent dealing with actual hardened criminals, the risks he'd taken, the victims he'd helped rescue. And now this, to be treated like a common thug by these glorified mall cops because of the color of his skin and their rank incompetence. The indignity was a bitter pill, but he was also a pragmatist. Being tased, arrested, and further humiliated on a jet bridge was not going to help his career, his current assignment, or his blood pressure. He needed to regain control of the narrative, but he couldn't do it from the floor with a taser pointed at him. He slowly lowered himself to his knees, the rough surface of the jet bridge biting into them. "I am not resisting," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "But you are making a very serious mistake." "Shut up," Diaz yelled, yanking David's arms behind his back with unnecessary force, trying to apply the handcuffs. He was clumsy, and the cold metal scraped against David's wrists. It was in that moment, as the first handcuff clicked shut, that David felt something snap within him. Not his control, but his willingness to passively endure this charade any longer. The public spectacle had been bad enough. This physical assault, this demeaning act of being cuffed like a common criminal by these two, was a line crossed. From the corner of his eye, he saw Gate Agent Henderson hovering at the end of the jet bridge, looking pale and anxious. A few passengers from the front of the plane were craning their necks, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. "All right," David said, his voice dangerously calm. "You want to see my ID, you'll see it. But when I show it to you, every single one of you involved in this farce is going to regret this day, profoundly." Miller, still aiming the taser, let out a harsh laugh. "Big words for a guy in cuffs. Let's get him off the bridge. We'll sort him out downstairs." He gestured with his head for Diaz to pull David up. As Diaz hauled him to his feet, David knew the time for quiet compliance was over. The next move would change everything. Diaz roughly maneuvered David towards the jet bridge door, leading to the terminal stairs, Miller still covering them with the taser. Gate Agent Henderson scurried ahead to open the door, his face a mask of anxiety. He clearly wanted this problem removed from his gate area as quickly as possible. "All right, officer," Miller sneered as they reached the small landing at the top of the stairs. "Let's see that sensitive bag of yours. Diaz, open it up. Carefully. Could be anything in there." Diaz, still jittery, fumbled with the zippers on David's backpack, which he'd slung over his own shoulder. David watched him, his expression unreadable. He could feel his heart rate steady until now begin to climb, not with fear, but with a cold gathering fury. "Be careful with that," David said, his voice low and resonant. "It contains federal property." Yeah, federal property, sure," Miller scoffed, but there was a tiny tremor in his voice now. Perhaps the sheer unwavering certainty in David's tone was beginning to penetrate his thick skull. Diaz finally got the main compartment open. He peered inside, then his eyes widened slightly. He pulled out a hard-sided locked gun case. "Miller, there's a gun case here. It's locked." Miller's bravado hitched. "See, I told you he is armed." He sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. "As I stated multiple times," David said, his voice cutting through the tension, "I am a federal law enforcement officer, flying armed in full compliance with 49 U.S.C. IRD 44903D and all applicable TSA and airline regulations. My firearm is declared and secured. My credentials, which you seem so eager to dismiss, are also in that bag." He focused his gaze on Miller. "Officer Miller, before your man Diaz puts his hands any further into my property, I suggest you listen very carefully. The actions you have taken here, removing me from a flight without lawful cause, making false accusations, physically assaulting and unlawfully restraining me, are not only profoundly unprofessional, they are illegal. You are about to make a career-ending mistake, if you haven't already." The conviction in David's voice, the specific legal citation, finally seemed to land with the force of a physical blow. Miller lowered his taser slightly, his eyes darting from David to the gun case and back. Diaz looked utterly terrified, his hands frozen over the backpack. Gate Agent Henderson, who had been trying to make himself small by the door, now looked like he was about to be physically ill. "My badge and credentials are in the front pocket of the bag," David continued, his voice like ice. "I suggest you retrieve them, slowly, and then you will call your supervisor, the airport police commander, and the ranking Global Air Connect manager for this terminal. You will also request a representative from the FBI Atlanta field office to come to this location. Am I clear?" Miller swallowed hard. The sneer was gone, replaced by a dawning horror. He looked at Diaz. "The front pocket. Check it." His voice was barely a whisper. Diaz, trembling visibly now, unzipped the front compartment. He reached in, and his fingers brushed against a small leather case. He pulled it out. It was a black bifold wallet. He fumbled it open. The glint of gold was unmistakable, even in the dim light of the stairwell. Diaz's breath hitched. His face went white. He held the open wallet out towards Miller, his hand shaking so violently the leather creaked. Miller, look." Miller leaned in. Staring back at him was the official seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and beneath it, the unmistakable credentials of a special agent, complete with David Robinson's photograph and signature. The silence in the stairwell was suddenly absolute, save for the distant rumble of a departing aircraft. For a long moment, no one moved. Miller's eyes were glued to the badge, his face slowly draining of all color, leaving behind a sickly gray pallor. The taser in his hand sagged its red laser dot now painting a harmless circle on the dusty floor. Then the panic hit. It started with Miller. A choked gasp escaped his lips. He looked up at David, at the man he had mocked, threatened, and manhandled, and saw not the suspicious individual his prejudice had conjured, but a bona fide federal agent, an agent of the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country, an agent he had just unlawfully detained and assaulted. "Oh my God!" Miller breathed, stumbling back a step, his eyes wide with terror. "Oh my God! Diaz! He's FBI!" Diaz looked like he was about to faint. He dropped the wallet as if it had burned him. It landed with a soft thud on the grimy concrete floor. We didn't know," he stammered, looking wildly between Miller and David. Gate Agent Henderson, witnessing this from the doorway, let out a small whimpering sound and actually clutched his chest. His carefully constructed world of gate schedules and passenger manifests had just imploded. "Pick it up," David commanded, his voice devoid of any emotion now. It was the voice he used when he was in absolute control of a volatile situation, the voice of authority. Miller, moving like a puppet whose strings had been cut, bent down shakily and retrieved the badge and credentials. He held them as if they were a venomous snake. "Now." David continued the handcuffs, still biting into his wrists, a stark reminder of their gross misconduct. "You will uncuff me. Then you will make those calls, in that precise order. And Mr. Henderson," he added, his gaze shifting to the terrified gate agent, "you will stay right where you are. You're part of this too." Henderson nodded mutely, his eyes wide with fear. Miller fumbled for the handcuff key, his hands shaking so badly he could barely insert it into the lock. The click of the cuffs opening was deafening in the sudden oppressive silence. David brought his hands forward, rubbing his chafed wrists, his eyes never leaving Miller. The power dynamic had not just shifted. It had been annihilated and rebuilt with David Robinson at its apex. The two security guards, moments before, puffed up with self-importance and prejudice, were now reduced to trembling, terrified functionaries, staring into the abyss of their own catastrophic misjudgment. Flight attendant Karen, who had apparently crept closer to the jet bridge door from the aircraft side to see what was happening, poked her head out. She saw the expressions on Miller's and Diaz's faces, saw David Robinson standing free, his gaze like granite, and her smugness evaporated, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated panic. She tried to retreat, but David's voice, sharp and clear, stopped her dead. "Miss Karen," he said without turning his head, "don't go anywhere. We have a lot to discuss, all of us." The real storm had just begun, and for Miller, Diaz, Henderson, and Karen the forecast was looking dire. The next 30 minutes in that cramped jet bridge stairwell were a masterclass in controlled fury and bureaucratic unraveling. David Robinson, despite the adrenaline still coursing through his veins and the lingering sting of humiliation, operated with the chilling efficiency of a seasoned investigator. His FBI training kicked in, overriding the personal insult, focusing on procedure evidence and accountability. Miller, his face ashen, made the calls on his radio. His voice trembling so badly he had to repeat himself several times. First to his direct supervisor at ASI Secure Solutions. The initial disbelief on the other end of the radio was palpable, quickly followed by barely concealed panic when Miller managed to choke out the words "FBI agent" and "unlawful detention." Then came the call to the airport police. The APD dispatcher was initially confused, then alarmed. The idea of private security guards manhandling a federal agent on airport property was a jurisdictional nightmare. David could hear the squawk of other radios in the background as the information spread like wildfire. While Miller was stammering his way through the calls, David turned his attention to Diaz, who was leaning against the wall, looking like he might collapse. "Officer Diaz," David said, his voice calm but firm. "Your full name and badge number." Diaz recited them, his voice barely a whisper. "And your supervisor's name?" Diaz provided that, too. David made a mental note. He had a near-photographic memory, a useful tool in his profession. Next was Gate Agent Henderson, who was wringing his hands, his eyes darting nervously towards the sounds of approaching sirens, faint at first, then growing rapidly louder. "Mr. Henderson," David began, "you witnessed the initial interaction on the aircraft, and you were present throughout this incident on the jet bridge. Is that correct?" Henderson nodded vigorously. "Yes, sir. Agent Robinson, sir. I didn't. I just thought—" "You thought what, Mr. Henderson?" David pressed gently, but with an undertone that brooked no evasion. That it was acceptable to remove a passenger based on an unsubstantiated claim from a flight attendant without any due diligence. Henderson's face crumpled. Ms. Brennan. Karen. She said he was being disruptive, staring at her, making her uncomfortable. She insisted he be removed before departure. Staring at her. David repeated a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. That was the basis for this entire fiasco. And did you or anyone else verify this disruptive behavior? Henderson looked down. No, sir. We. ASI handles security. So you abdicated your responsibility as the airline's representative on the ground. David's tone was becoming sharper. This wasn't just about Miller and Diaz anymore. It was about systemic failure. Flight attendant Karen Brennan, who had been frozen by David's earlier command, was now approached by him. She was visibly shaking, her earlier composure shattered. "Ms. Brennan," David said, his voice low, "what exactly did I do to make you uncomfortable?" Karen stammered. You were just looking intensely, and you didn't smile. It felt threatening." David stared at her, incredulous. "I was reading a book, Ms. Brennan, and my facial expression, or lack thereof, is grounds for removal from a flight, for being accused of causing a disturbance. Is that the professional standard of Global Air Connect?" Karen burst into tears. I don't know, I was stressed. It's been a long day. There have been alerts about, suspicious people." She trailed off, realizing too late how damning her words sounded. "Suspicious people," David echoed, his voice dangerously soft. "And what Miss Brennan made me fit that description in your mind?" "Be specific." She couldn't meet his eyes. Her prejudice laid bare was ugly and indefensible. Her tears seemed less about remorse and more about the realization of her own culpability. The wail of sirens was very close now. Heavy footsteps pounded up the metal stairs. The first to arrive were two uniformed Atlanta Police Department officers, their expressions grim and wary. They were quickly followed by a harried-looking man in a suit, the ASI Secure Solutions supervisor, Mr. Davis, and a woman in a Global Air Connect uniform with a managerial name badge, Ms. Albright, the Terminal Operations Manager. The APD officers immediately took in the scene, David Robinson, calm and composed, holding his FBI credentials, Miller and Diaz looking utterly broken, Henderson pale and sweating, Karen Brennan weeping quietly. Agent Robinson, the senior APD officer. Sergeant Miles asked, his voice respectful but cautious. David nodded. Special Agent David Robinson, FBI. Thank you for your prompt response, Sergeant. He then proceeded to give a concise, factual account of the events, from the moment Miller and Diaz approached him on the aircraft to his unlawful restraint in the stairwell. He detailed the baseless accusations, the refusal to listen to his explanations, the escalation by Miller, and the fear and incompetence displayed by Diaz. He mentioned Henderson's passivity and Karen Brennan's apparent false report based on prejudice. As David spoke, Ms. Albright, the Global Air Connect manager, listened with a horrified expression. Mr. Davies, the ASI supervisor, looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. He kept shooting venomous looks at Miller and Diaz, who were now the subjects of intense scrutiny from the APD officers. Sergeant David concluded, I was unlawfully detained, verbally threatened, and physically assaulted by officers Miller and Diaz of ASI Secure Solutions, based on what appears to be a false and discriminatory report initiated by Global Air Connect flight attendant Karen Brennan and facilitated by gate agent Henderson. I wish to file a formal complaint against all parties involved. I also want their body camera footage, if any and all surveillance footage from this jet bridge and gate C-33 preserved immediately. Sergeant Miles nodded gravely. Understood, Agent Robinson. We will secure all available footage. APD will take your full statement. Officers Miller and Diaz, you are to remain here. You will be interviewed. He then turned to Davies. Mr. Davies, I expect your full cooperation. Your men are potentially facing serious charges, not to mention the civil ramifications for your company. Davies wrung his hands. Absolutely, Sergeant. ASI does not condone this type of behavior. We will cooperate fully. Miller Diaz, you are both suspended, effective immediately. Hand over your badges and access cards. Miller and Diaz, their faces a mixture of shock and despair, numbly complied, handing their credentials to their now ex-supervisor. Their careers, they knew, were over. But their troubles were just beginning. Ms. Albright, the airline manager, finally found her voice addressing David directly. Agent Robinson on behalf of Global Air Connect. I am appalled, horrified. This is completely unacceptable. We will launch an immediate and thorough internal investigation. Ms. Brennan and Mr. Henderson will be removed from duty pending the outcome of that investigation. We will, of course, cooperate fully with the FBI and the APD. She looked genuinely distressed, but David knew that corporate apologies, while necessary, were often just the first step in a long dance of damage control. I appreciate that, Ms. Albright, David said, but this goes beyond an apology. This was a violation of my rights and a clear case of racial profiling with severe operational security implications for LEOs. The FBI will be taking this matter very seriously. Just then, two more figures arrived, Special Agent in Charge, SAC Mark Bellamy, from the FBI Atlanta field office, a stern, gray-haired man David knew well, accompanied by another agent. Bellamy's face was like thunder. He'd clearly been briefed on the way over. He walked straight to David. David, are you all right? Physically, yes, Mark. Professionally, I'm furious, David replied. Bellamy nodded, then surveyed the scene. The disgraced security guards, the distraught airline staff, the APD officers. His gaze was icy. I want a full report on my desk by morning, David, Bellamy said. Then he turned to the assembled group. Let me be clear. The FBI views any assault on or unlawful detention of its agents as an attack on the Bureau itself. The fact that this incident appears to have been motivated by prejudice and incompetence makes it all the more egregious. We will be pursuing this to the fullest extent of the law." His words hung heavy in the air. For Miller, Diaz. Karen, Brennan, and Henderson, the full weight of their actions was crashing down upon them. This wasn't just about losing their jobs anymore. This was about facing the wrath of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The initial karma was swift suspensions, public disgrace in front of their colleagues and superiors. But David Robinson knew, and SAC Bellamy's presence confirmed, that this was just the overture. The real symphony of consequences was yet to be composed. The days following the incident at Hartsfield-Jackson were a blur of official statements, internal investigations, and legal consultations. David Robinson, while back at his duties at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., was frequently updated by SAC Bellamy in Atlanta. The Bureau, true to Bellamy's word, was not taking this lightly. An official FBI inquiry was launched running parallel to the APD's criminal investigation and Global Air Connect's internal review. ASI Secure Solutions. The company that employed Miller and Diaz went into full crisis mode. Their initial response was a public statement expressing deep regret and emphasizing that the actions of Miller and Diaz were isolated incidents not representative of ASI's commitment to professionalism and respect. They also highlighted that both officers had been terminated. However, behind the scenes, a more desperate game was being played. ASI's legal team, fearing a massive lawsuit and the potential loss of their lucrative airport security contract, began to subtly probe for weaknesses in David's account or for ways to mitigate the damage. They couldn't directly discredit an FBI agent, especially one with an impeccable record like David, but they could try to muddy the waters. Their first gambit was to suggest that Miller and Diaz, while perhaps overzealous, were acting in good faith based on a credible report from an airline crew member. Flight attendant Karen Brennan. They attempted to paint Brennan as a diligent employee, concerned about passenger safety, shifting the blame onto her misinterpretation of David's demeanor. Karen Brennan, meanwhile, was in her own personal hell. Suspended from Global Air Connect, facing potential criminal charges for making a false report, and vilified in internal airline circles, she became increasingly erratic. Her initial tearful apologies gave way to a desperate attempt at self-preservation. Encouraged by a lawyer who saw a chance for a protracted and profitable dispute, she began to change her story subtly. She started claiming David had been argumentative and non-compliant from the very beginning, trying to legitimize the security intervention. She even hinted that she felt intimidated by him, not just because he was staring, but because he seemed overly interested in the cockpit and security procedures, a baseless and inflammatory accusation designed to sow doubt. Gate Agent Henderson, on the other hand, quickly crumbled. During his formal interview with APD detectives and an FBI agent from Bellamy's team, he provided a truthful if self-serving account. He admitted he had taken Brennan's word without question, partly due to the stress of a busy boarding, and partly because ASI Security was supposed to handle such verifications. He expressed profound regret and offered his full cooperation. Global Air Connect. Seeing his contrition, and likely his utility as a witness against Brennan and ASI, kept him on suspension, but indicated a possibility of reassignment to a non-passenger-facing role if he continued to cooperate. The body camera footage from Miller and Diaz became a crucial piece of evidence. While ASI had initially dragged its feet on releasing it citing privacy concerns, a subpoena from the APD quickly materialized it. The footage was damning. It captured Miller's aggressive and unprofessional language, Diaz's nervous incompetence, and David Robinson's calm, repeated attempts to de-escalate and identify himself properly. Crucially, it also captured Miller's mocking dismissal of David's claim to be a federal officer before the situation escalated to physical restraint. It directly contradicted ASI's initial attempts to frame the incident as a good faith error. A twist emerged when an anonymous source within ASI Secure Solutions leaked internal emails to a local Atlanta investigative journalist. These emails, sent in the hours immediately following the incident, showed ASI executives less concerned with the well-being of Agent Robinson or the conduct of their employees, and more focused on containment and narrative control. One email from ASI's regional director explicitly instructed supervisors to emphasize the flight attendant's report as the primary catalyst, and to explore any and all avenues to demonstrate procedural adherence by our officers, even if ex post facto. This leak was a PR disaster for ASI. The journalist, smelling a major story of corporate malfeasance and racial profiling, began digging deeper. She interviewed former ASI employees who described a company culture that often prioritized aggressive enforcement over de-escalation, particularly at the busy Atlanta airport. There were whispers of inadequate training and pressure to meet incident quotas, though the latter was harder to substantiate. David, upon learning of Brennan's changing story and ASI's attempted cover-up, felt a renewed surge of cold anger. It was one thing to be profiled and assaulted due to incompetence and prejudice. It was another entirely to have his character and professionalism actively smeared in a desperate attempt to evade accountability. SAC Bellamy assured him, "Don't worry, David. They're just digging themselves a deeper hole. We have the facts. We have the footage." Brennan's revised testimony is riddled with inconsistencies when compared to her initial statements and Henderson's account. And this email leak, it's a gift. The FBI also looked into Karen Brennan's work history with Global Air Connect. They discovered a pattern of minor complaints from passengers, often citing her abrasive or judgmental attitude. Nothing that had previously warranted more than a verbal warning, but taken together, it painted a picture of an employee who perhaps felt overly empowered or harbored certain biases. There was even one prior incident where she had requested security to speak with a passenger of Middle Eastern descent, who she claimed was acting nervously, only for it to be a misunderstanding. This discovery further weakened her credibility and strengthened the profiling argument. The airline Global Air Connect was now in full damage control, eager to distance itself from both ASI and Brennan. Miss Albright, the terminal operations manager, became the point person for cooperating with the FBI. She ensured that all requested documents, including Brennan's employment file and training records, were handed over swiftly. The airline also began a top-to-bottom review of its own security reporting protocols and bias training for its flight crews. They knew that their reputation was on the line. They had already started to see a small but noticeable dip in bookings on the Atlanta, D.C. route, as word of the incident, initially confined to official channels, began to leak into frequent flyer forums and social media, albeit without all the specific details yet. The pressure was mounting on all fronts. Miller and Diaz, now officially terminated and facing potential criminal charges of assault battery and unlawful imprisonment, were offered deals by the Fulton County District Attorney's Office, pled guilty to lesser charges, and testified truthfully about ASI's training and operational procedures and Brennan's initial report. Diaz, terrified of jail time and feeling betrayed by ASI, was reportedly considering it. Miller, more stubborn and perhaps still clinging to a shred of his shattered pride, was holding out, but his lawyer was strongly advising him to reconsider. The hard karma was beginning to take shape, not as a single, swift blow, but as a slow, relentless grind of legal, professional, and reputational destruction for those who had wronged Agent Robinson. And for ASI Secure Solutions, the attempted cover-up was about to backfire, spectacularly threatening their very existence. The dominoes set in motion by that fateful encounter on Global Air Connect, Flight 723, began to fall with increasing speed and resounding impact. The hard karma David Robinson had quietly promised in the jet bridge stairwell materialized not as a vengeful outburst, but as the systematic dismantling of careers' reputations and corporate arrogance through the due process of law and public opinion. The fate of Miller and Diaz. Faced with the irrefutable body cam evidence, the testimony of Gate Agent Henderson, and the looming prospect of a federal civil rights lawsuit, both former ASI officers saw the writing on the wall. Diaz was the first to break. He accepted a plea deal from the Fulton County DA, plead guilty to misdemeanor assault and unlawful restraint, receive probation, community service, mandatory anger management, and bias training, and agree to testify truthfully in any further proceedings against ASI or Karen Brennan. His law enforcement career was over before it had barely begun a permanent stain on his record. Miller, more belligerent and initially resistant, finally succumbed to the pressure from his own attorney after seeing the strength of the evidence and the potential for a lengthy prison sentence if convicted on felony charges. He negotiated a slightly harsher plea than Diaz, due to his role as the aggressor and his attempt to use a taser, guilty of aggravated assault, reduced from a higher charge and unlawful imprisonment, resulting in a short jail term, a few months largely mitigated by a first offender program. But still, time served extended probation, substantial fines, and the same mandated training as Diaz. His security career was definitively finished. Both men would also be key witnesses in the civil lawsuit David Robinson was now preparing. Karen Brennan's downfall. Flight attendant, Karen Brennan's attempt to rewrite her narrative proved disastrous. Her revised statements were so contradictory to her initial on-scene admissions witnessed by Henderson and the APD officers, and the objective evidence that she faced charges of making a false report to law enforcement and perjury, in addition to potential civil liability. Global Air Connect, after its internal investigation, corroborated the FBI's findings of her discriminatory behavior and false statements, terminated her employment for gross misconduct. The DA's office, armed with Henderson's testimony and evidence of her prior questionable conduct, offered her a stark choice: plead to making a false report and receive probation or face trial on more serious charges. Humiliated and financially drained by legal fees, Brennan eventually pleaded guilty. She received probation, a hefty fine, and was ordered to undergo intensive anti-bias and cultural sensitivity training. Her career in the airline industry was over. She became a pariah, a cautionary tale whispered about in crew lounges. ASI Secure Solutions. Corporate karma. ASI Secure Solutions faced the most devastating consequences. The leaked internal emails suggesting a cover-up, coupled with the damning testimony of Miller and Diaz regarding inadequate training and a culture that tacitly encouraged aggressive behavior, painted a picture of profound corporate negligence. The investigative journalist who had broken the email story published a series of scathing articles citing past complaints and revealing systemic issues within ASI. This triggered not only public outrage, but also scrutiny from the Aviation Security Advisory Committee and the TASE itself regarding ASI's fitness to hold sensitive airport security contracts. Hartsfield Jackson. Atlanta International Airport, under immense pressure from the city, the FAA and public opinion initiated a review of its contract with ASI. The negative publicity was damaging the airport's reputation. Simultaneously, David Robinson's attorneys filed a substantial federal civil rights lawsuit against ASI Secure Solutions. Miller and Diaz, citing unlawful detention assault, racial discrimination, and conspiracy to cover up misconduct. The suit also named Global Air Connect for vicarious liability due to Brennan's actions. Though the airline was in a much better position due to its cooperative stance and immediate remedial actions. Faced with mounting legal fees, the threat of losing its largest contract at ATL, and the catastrophic damage to its brand ASI's stock plummeted if it were a publicly traded entity or its valuation if private. The lawsuit was a sword of Damocles. Other airports using ASI services began to nervously review their own contracts. Ultimately, ASI Secure Solutions was forced into a massive settlement with David Robinson. The terms were confidential, but rumored to be in the 7 figures. More significantly, as part of a consent decree with the Department of Justice, which had also opened a pattern or practice investigation following the Robinson incident and the subsequent revelations, ASI was forced to overhaul its training programs, nationwide implement stringent de-escalation and anti-bias protocols, and operate under federal monitoring for several years. However, the damage was too severe. Within 18 months, Hartsfield-Jackson terminated its contract with ASI Secure Solutions, citing a loss of confidence in their ability to provide security services consistent with the airport's standards and values. This was the death knell. Other contracts soon followed suit. ASI, once a significant player in the airport security industry, was crippled, eventually being bought out for pennies on the dollar by a larger competitor, its name vanishing into ignominy. Global Air Connect's reckoning and reforms. Global Air Connect, while also named in the civil suit, fared better due to its proactive cooperation and swift internal reforms. They reached a separate, smaller settlement with David Robinson. More importantly, the incident served as a brutal wake-up call. Ms. Albright, the terminal operations manager, spearheaded a company-wide initiative to revamp training for all flight and ground crews. This included enhanced de-escalation techniques, comprehensive implicit bias training, developed in consultation with civil rights organizations, and clearer protocols for reporting and verifying passenger behavior concerns with multiple checks and balances before escalating to security. They made Henderson's testimony and his contrition a part of their training material, highlighting the dangers of unchecked assumptions. The airline also publicly apologized to Agent Robinson and made a significant donation to a non-profit organization dedicated to fighting racial injustice. While the incident was a black eye, their response demonstrated a commitment to change, slowly rebuilding trust. David Robinson's path. For David Robinson, the outcome was bittersweet. He had received justice, and his ordeal had triggered significant positive changes. He had stood his ground and ensured accountability. The financial settlement was secondary. The core victory was the exposure of systemic prejudice and the reforms it forced. However, the experience left its scars. The memory of the humiliation, the casual disdain, the terrifying ease with which his rights were stripped away, lingered. It reinforced his commitment to his work at the FBI, particularly in areas of civil rights and public integrity. He didn't seek the spotlight, but his case became a known, albeit often anonymized example within law enforcement and aviation circles about the realities of racial profiling and the importance of professionalism at all levels of security. He continued his career an even more determined agent, carrying the weight of that day, as a reminder of the vigilance required to protect not just national security, but also the fundamental rights of every citizen. The hard karma had indeed hit back, not with a simple eye for an eye, but with the full grinding force of systemic correction, ensuring that the echoes of that confrontation in the jet bridge stairwell would resonate for years to come, changing policies, ending careers, and hopefully preventing others from enduring what Special Agent David Robinson had been forced to endure. The incident on Global Air Connect Flight 723 left indelible marks. For David Robinson, life as an FBI special agent continued, yet he was changed. The raw vulnerability he'd experienced fueled a quiet advocacy for diversity and improved training within law enforcement. He rarely detailed his ordeal, but when he did, it served as a potent lesson on prejudice and its power to corrupt justice. The significant financial settlement he received was channeled into foundations fighting for criminal justice reform, transforming a personal trauma into a tool for broader good. Hartsfield-Jackson, Atlanta International Airport, after ousting ASI Secure Solutions, radically reformed its security oversight. Stricter vendor vetting, mandatory, comprehensive training in de-escalation and civil rights, and a new independent passenger advocacy office signaled a new era of accountability. The Atlanta incident became a crucial case study in aviation security, ensuring its lessons resonated industry-wide. Global Air Connect, under Ms. Albright's guidance, also embraced profound change. Their revamped training on implicit bias and passenger rights became central to their corporate identity. Gate Agent Henderson, humbled, contributed to this new training, sharing his experience as a cautionary tale. The airline, through sustained effort, slowly rebuilt its reputation, demonstrating a genuine commitment to passenger dignity. The architects of David's humiliation faced lasting consequences. Miller, after his jail term, found his life and career prospects shattered. Diaz, burdened by his actions, sought anonymity in a different state and field. Karen Brennan, her airline career over, and reputation ruined by her false and prejudiced report, faded into obscurity. Their fates served as stark reminders of the personal cost of unchecked bias and abuse of authority. Years later, walking through Hartsfield-Jackson, David Robinson would observe the changes a quiet testament to the ordeal he'd endured. His experience hadn't just been about personal vindication. It had forced a reckoning within the systems meant to protect. The hard karma had not only punished the wrongdoers, but had also carved a path toward a more conscious and just operational standard. The echoes of that day continued to serve as a powerful reminder. One individual standing firm against injustice could indeed spark significant, lasting change, making the skies a little fairer for all. And so justice, though hard-fought and profoundly personal for Agent Robinson, rippled outwards, bringing systemic change. The consequences for the individuals and the companies involved were severe, a direct result of their prejudice, incompetence, and attempts to evade accountability. Agent Robinson's ordeal at Hartsfield-Jackson, Atlanta International Airport, became a stark reminder that abuse of power and racial profiling have no place in our skies or anywhere else. This wasn't just about one man's struggle. It was about the integrity of the systems designed to protect us all. What do you think about this outcome? Was justice truly served for Agent Robinson, and did the repercussions for ASI Secure Solutions? Global Air Connect and the individuals involved fit their actions. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, or if you believe in standing up against injustice and demanding accountability, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe to your channel name for more gripping stories and compelling narratives. Your support helps us bring these important issues to light and ensures these stories are heard. Thanks for watching and fly safe.